Hi, my name is Stephen Smith, and this is the training for problem to issue or community organizing. You can use them in either sense. First thing you're going to do is you're going to write up on the board what the training is. 6 steps to community organizing. You can also, again, say these are the 6 steps to go from problem to issue. And then you want to define what the training is. So you take a minute or two to say, when we talk about community organizing, we're talking about 2 things. One, we're talking about winning on issues. And we want to make a real change in our communities, whether that's increasing the minimum wage or improving a housing complex or starting a hunger program, whatever it is, we want to make real change. The other half of community organizing, though, is that just as important to us as making a real change is developing leadership and capacity so that the next time we've got to fight on something, we're even stronger. So I would define community organizing that way at the beginning of the training. If you're going to focus on going from problem to issue, again, it's the same thing, but I might say, look, a problem is something you complain about, whereas an issue is something you can do something about. We're going to go from problem to issue, or from nowhere to change, or from here to community organizing. Just basically set it up. Now, this training is a really good one for people who are already organized into teams, that they can really focus in on how am I going to work with my team, what issue should we work on. But it also works well for a big group of people who just want to learn the basics of community organizing. So the way the training starts is actually fairly Socratic, and this is a training where there's a whole lot of back and forth, which is part of what makes it fun. So the first thing I would do to start this training is, where do we begin? I would actually ask the question of the group, where do we begin? Where would we start? Some people say, well, you need to go out and talk to people. And I might say, well, even before that, what's the very first thing you need to start with? And the answer, the very first thing, and this would be my first step, and I'd write it up on the board, is you have to start with a problem. And not just a problem, but a story about that problem. Another way to say step 1, and I sometimes write all of these words up on the board, is anger. You want to start with something, a problem that's personal to you, that's happened to you, etc. And then I would ask the group, why do we start with a personal story or problem? We could start with so many things. Why start with that? And I would say, I would get them to come up with some of the reasons, but I'm just going to give some of them to you so that you can use them in your training. We start with a personal story about a problem because we need something that's personal. We need something that affects us right here so that it'll keep us going through the next 5 steps. We need something personal, a personal story, because it's way better to communicate with other people if we have a personal story than if we're just trying to talk about statistics. It's a much more personal thing. It's a better communications tool if we start with a story. The other reason we start with a story is that it's specific. If you start with a big problem like poverty or income inequality, you can't do anything about something that big. You want to start with something specific so that you know that when you come up with a solution to your problem, it's something you're going to be able to look back and go, oh, we really affected that personal problem that we talked about. Starting with a story is also a good way of making sure that you're staying grounded in communities. That if we're asking people to tell stories about what personally affects them, that's what democracy is, rather than just being, some intellectual pursuit. So first thing we start with is stories. And then I would say, well, how do we find stories? And people would come up with some good ideas. Some that I'll put up there. You can have house meetings where you just get people talking. You can do a survey. Survey isn't a great place to find stories, but you can at least get some that way. Or you do one-to-one meetings where you're face-to-face with someone and you share some of your stories and they share some of theirs. And then I would have the group practice. Say, okay, everybody take a minute, think of something that's happened to you or someone you love that makes you angry, a problem that you've seen personally and that personally affects you. I'd make a big point of that. And then we would take examples from the audience. and I try to take at least 3 to 4 examples of specific stories that people have and from the audience. And then I always try to note, after people tell those stories, I thank each person for taking the courage to tell their stories. And I try to find one that would make for a really good demonstration for the group. And I ask that person, hey, would you be willing to come up here to the front and be our model person, be our beginning story? And that really sets off the training. The other thing I'll notice after we tell those stories is I'll make a comment about how, and this always happens, the feeling in the room changes when people start telling stories that are personal to them. So as a group, we've identified some stories. We've got someone up here at the front of the room with me who's willing to serve as a sort of guinea pig, and we'll go from there. Now, one quick note, if you're working with a group that's already identified a few problems that they might want to work on, now is a really good time to split people up into groups. So if you're working with a group, they've already come up with some problems, now's a good time to split them in groups based on those problems. You don't have to do that, but if you've got people, now's a good time to do that. So I've got my person up here, and I'll say, okay, we've got an angry person, right? That's like a blog, right? Or someone complaining at a party. It's not a bad thing. It may help raise some awareness, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for real change and leadership development. So what comes next? Again, we'll go back and forth, but the answer I'm looking for is step 2, build a team. And I'll talk about how we don't just want more people, we want a team of people. People who know that they're on a team, people who know their roles. I ask people to think about, what does it mean to be on a team, and go into that and talk about that, how it's people knowing their roles, working together, people you can rely on, people you trust. And then I'll say, what kinds of people do we want on our team? Now that we know what our problem is, what kind of people do we want on our team? And everybody has good ideas. Some that I make sure to put up on the board are, you want money people, which doesn't necessarily mean people who have a lot of money, but people who are willing to contribute money and resources. You want people. You want folks who can bring other people with them to the table, and you might brainstorm a couple of different examples of that. A teacher or a pastor of a church, or just someone who knows lots of folks. So you want people, money people. You want people who are directly affected by the issue. Talk about how important that is. And you want people with different skills and expertise. And there are other things you can put up there. But every team, you want at least those 4 different groups represented. And then I would have my person up here, and maybe the folks out in the audience, if they're in their groups, brainstorm who they want on their team. And I would even have this person up at the front of the room call people out from the audience that they want on their team and say why they want that person. This is really important because it teaches people how you actually build a team. And this is what you talk about in the training, is I would say, how do you build your team? What's the best way to build your team? And someone's going to say Facebook, and someone's going to say email, and those are fine. But the real way to build your team is one-to-one meetings. Face-to-face, one-on-one, asking someone, hey, you matter to me. This is why I want you on my team. I think you could really bring this to the team. And then you talk about why that's so important with the group. Maybe even have them, as I said, practice it. Hey, can you practice telling this person why you want them on their team and then inviting them to be a part of their team? What you want folks to get out of this is that it's not just about raising awareness. You really want a team of people who know what their roles are and that you've treated them as an individual, not just, hey, you should be a part of my team, some blast email, but really taking the time to choose who you want on your team, and that it's about relationships. A lot of these people on your team may be people that you just are friends with or that you care about and that you like working with, and that's a perfectly good reason to have that person on your team. All right, now we've got our teams, or at least a good idea of who we want on our teams. And I'll pause sometimes here to say, well, look right now, steps 1 and 2, these are the things that take us the most time in real life, and oftentimes they're the things that take us the most amount of time in our trainings as well. And that's okay. We want to take time identifying real stories about what's wrong. We want to take time building good, strong teams. I'll also take a moment here to recognize, look, even if you stop here, this is pretty good. Having a team of people who are angry and passionate, imagine a protest or a rally. A lot of protests and rallies, a lot of activism stops right here. And if that's what you're doing, that's okay. But there's more that can be done. And that gets us to step 3. Step 3 is that you have to know what you want. Another way to put it is that you have a specific, impactful, winnable goal or goals. Specific, impactful, winnable. And we go through each one of those, and what does it mean? Specific. Specific means that you've got to pick something where you will know if you've succeeded. For example, we were working on an issue where we wanted to restore $980,000 in funding to children's programs in West Virginia. That is very specific. We'll know if those dollars end up in those programs or not, because they're going to get a check. And it's not $1 million or roughly $1 million. It's $980,000. We're being very specific. Do you want police officers in your neighborhood to be better trained? Okay, well, what is it specifically that you want? Well, maybe what you want is you want a specific change in the curriculum in the way that state police officers are trained at the academy, right? Again, very specific. If you can get even more specific, the better. Second is you want an issue that's impactful, right? So, is it something that's actually going to affect this story? Imagine the person in that story we told at the beginning. Will their lives actually be different if we win this thing? That's a hugely important question. And it's to keep us away from doing things that are just purely symbolic, right? For instance, one of the issues our campaign considered working on was a resolution stating that child poverty is a problem in West Virginia and that it should be ended in West Virginia, a resolution by the legislature. But we didn't work on it in part because we felt like it didn't have, that passing that resolution wouldn't have a direct impact on kids who are hungry. So, is your proposal specific? Is it impactful? And then is it winnable? And we talk about why is it important to focus on things that are winnable. Well, you want to know if it's something that, if we're going to put a whole bunch of energy into something, is there a chance that we can actually win it? This is a really good part of the training, and it's a really tough part of the training. And I would say this to the group, this is the hardest part of organizing. It's the most complicated, it's the most frustrating part of organizing, because you're going to go into your team, and this is why team is so important. You're going to go into your team, and everybody's going to have different ideas about whether it's specific enough, about what actually is impactful, and about whether it's winnable. And this is a time where I'm going to give each group 5 or 10 minutes, or this group at the front of the room 5 or 10 minutes, to brainstorm different proposals, try to get at least a few possibilities on the board, and then hear feedback from them about what it is they're working on, and allow the other folks in the room the chance to give feedback as well. So for instance, let's go back to that group that wants to change the way that police are relating to young people. And maybe they come up with one idea that's training for police officers. Maybe another thing they want to do is provide body cameras for police officers. Maybe another thing they want is a youth oversight board for police officers. And they come up with all these ideas. We're going to have that group explain, give a little presentation about their proposals. And then we're going to ask them some questions. So I might say, well, who would you talk to find out more about body cameras? That sounds expensive. Is it winnable? Do we have the money for it? I might say, on one of the other issues, if you had a youth advisory board, how would we make sure that's really impactful and not just a youth group on the side. Now again, depending on who your group is and where you are in the process, you may spend half an hour, 45 minutes just on step 3, and that's okay. Maybe you have them take 15 minutes, come up with some ideas, present to the group, get some feedback, and go back into their group. But you want them to walk out of this with 2 or 3 ideas that are specific, impactful, and winnable. Next up, step 4. Now that we know what we want to win, we need to know who can get us what we want. And it's always one person, and it's a person. So Congress is not an answer to number 4. The legislature is not an answer to number 4. Number 4 is about who is a person who can get us what we want. So let's take again this example of this group. Maybe they decide that the thing they want is to involve young people in the actual training of officers at the academy, at the state academy. All right, and that's what they want. They want young people to be there giving 2 hours of training in the state academy about how to work with young people. All right, who is the person who can get us what you want? And you do a little bit of brainstorming here. Maybe you decide the person who can get us what we want is the head of the state police. Maybe it's a state legislator state legislator who is closely affiliated with the police and who we know has the influence. In any event, you want to pick one person as a group, and if you're working with multiple groups in the audience, have them pick one person. With a lot of student groups, it's going to be principals of high schools, mayors of towns, maybe even specific teachers, but one person, a school board president, one person, and then you're going to talk about what matters to that person. So if it's the state police director, maybe we don't know a lot, but maybe we guess that they're wanting to keep costs low. Maybe it matters to this person what the governor thinks or what legislators think. What we're trying to do is humanize this person and remember that they're a person too. Ideally, this person is someone that we already know and we can talk about what actually matters to them. But even if it's just thinking about what matters to them, that's okay. Step 5. You got to actually have the courage to ask this person for what you want. So step 5 is the courage to ask. And again, depending on how much time you've got for this training, you can do some great role plays here. We have the students sit down on one side, you play the person who is the person they're trying to convince, and you have a good back and forth so that they get the feeling of what it's like, and it sort of demystifies the process. If you don't have time for that, that's okay too. You can schedule that for a later date, but you want to sort of talk about how important it is to actually ask for what you want and not just get into the meeting and say, oh, we really think this is a problem. What do you think? You know, and make it a situation where you're giving away your power. We don't want that. We want to walk into our meeting and say, will you do this with us? Yes or no? And then I'm going to talk about preparing everybody for the fact that you're probably not going to get a yes or a no. You're going to get something like, oh, I'm really, this sounds really interesting. I need to hear, let me think about it and get back to you. Or this is really interesting. I'm not sure. I need to talk to some people and stew on this and I'll get back to you. Those are the kinds of answers you'll actually get. You don't get a yes or a no. And so you want to teach students in this training that there is a 4-word question that they want to ask in that situation when they don't get a yes or a no. And that question is this: what will it take? Meaning, what will it take for you to support our proposal? And sometimes you're going to have to ask this question 3 or 4 or 5 times. You're going to have to ask it a whole bunch of different ways. What will it take? And oftentimes they won't give you the answer right up front, but you want to be in a position where you get some real information, and maybe they're going to say, well, I really need to see if there's enough money. for this. Okay, fair enough. How can we help? Maybe they're going to say, well, I'm not sure this is really a problem. And you say, well, what can we do to prove it to you? What will it take? What would it take for us to convince you to work with us? And then step 6, which is related, and this is your final step, is to evaluate. And you want to evaluate right after you walk out of this meeting with that person who can get you what you want. You want to evaluate immediately. You want to talk about what went well and what didn't, but you also want to talk about where do we go from here. So let's say you're in a meeting about the curriculum, and the head of the state police says, well, I need to talk to our curriculum director and see if there are 2 hours that we could slide you in. And you say, okay. He says, and this is really interesting, but you know, I'm not sure this is something that anybody else really wants, right? So this sounds like a nice idea. I need to talk to my curriculum director, but I'm not really sure this is something that really matters to young people. And you say, maybe you go back up here. Well, maybe we can find some more young people with their own stories and bring them to you. Would that be helpful? Okay. Maybe the person says, well, this is really interesting, but I would want this to be something that police support and not just come from the community. And say, okay, well, if we brought more police onto our team, would that help? Basically, we're trying to get to a point where with the evaluation, we're going back up and figuring where we need to put more energy. Maybe they say, look, I really want to help you out, but my board has control of the curriculum. Would one of you come and present to the board? You got to find out, oh shoot, this person we thought was the person who can get us what we want isn't. But we come back and reevaluate and re-strategize. That's the training in a nutshell. Step 1, problem, story, anger. What's that personal story or personal experience or problem that you're dealing with, and telling that story, having the courage to tell that story. Building a team, again, having the courage to step out and involve new people one-on-one, asking people, will you be a part of this? Step 3, having the courage to have a real tough conversation, confusing, frustrating conversation among your team about what is it we're really going to fight for, not just what we're fighting against or what makes us angry, but what is it that we want and how can we make sure it's specific and impactful and winnable. Step 4, who can get us what we want and what matters to that person. Step 5, are we going to have the courage to really ask for what we want and hold them to the fire and say, what will it take to get it? And then step 6, we know that when we go through this the first time, it's not going to be the end. There is always more work to do. We got to be ready for that, ready to evaluate, ready to regroup, ready to keep going. A couple other tips I would mention for this training. One, you want to focus on when you choose a story as an example to come to the front of the room. If you do that, you want to choose a story that is very specific to help you come up with issues that are specific. Again, step 3 is something that you can spend a full hour, hour and a half on. Build it into the training, especially if you've already got people who've done some of this work, and have them think through it, work on it with their group, present it to the big group, get some feedback, even go back and work on it again. But you want people to think about, okay, can this be more specific? Could it be more impactful? What would make it more winnable? Really talk it through with each group in real terms. And then again, if you've got the time, you can include the role play as well. This training we just did took 25 minutes. So you can go through the information fairly quickly, but it's built as a training to have lots and lots of interaction. Ideally, this training, I think, lasts about 90 minutes. If you're going to spend more time on step 3, 2 hours, you can make it work. But anywhere between an hour to 2 hours, you can make the training fit. Good luck. My information is, my email is smith@wvhealthykids.org. My phone number is 304-610-6512. I'd be happy to hear from you. Again, my name is Stephen Smith. If you're looking to do a training like this in your community and I can help, or you want to talk through how to make it work, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Have a great day.